As you can see, we're missing one panelist, the Singaporean, Mr. Zakir Hussain, the foreign editor of the Straits Times, is having a little trouble getting a cab in the rain. So I used to live here in Singapore, and I know the plight well. So we'll give him a few minutes. Hopefully he can join us. But otherwise, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming. I've been to a few of these conferences before, and it's always the diversity of the people who attend that is the most impressive that the East-West Center can bring together. But I think one thing we can all agree on, no matter where we're from, is that whoever came up with that saying originally about living in interesting times had never met Donald Trump. We are living through a period that, under any circumstances, would have been a moment of an incredible flux, given the changes in technology and changes in trade flows and so on, particularly in Asia. Societies, countries would have been changed dramatically anyway, but now we've added on top of that a whole new layer of great power politics with the US and China jostling for a position and influence within the region for many countries, including Singapore. I think the challenge is how to take advantage of this, or at least how not to be caught in the crossfire. For the US and China, and also for some middle powers like Japan and India, it's more about how to make the right investments, how to establish the best partnerships in order to strengthen your position and to set yourself up for influence in what's arguably going to be the most important region in the world in this century. So to help us make sense of this, we have a distinguished, if slightly abbreviated panel here. We have, to my direct left, Raja Mohan, who is a visiting fellow with the Institute for South Asian Studies here in Singapore and was, until very recently, the founding head of Carnegie, India. Next to him is Satu Limaye from Washington, D.C. He is the executive director of the East-West Center there in D.C., I believe. And at the very end, our late and welcome addition, Ms. Wu Minsu, from the Communications University in Beijing, of China, in Beijing, which is the highest rated journalistic institution in China. So, Satu, let me start with you. I'm just going to ask a few questions, and then we can turn it over to the audience after a bit. But given the fact that what's happening in Washington and what's happening with this administration sort of sucks all the oxygen out of the room news-wise, even out here in Asia. How would you rate what's happened? Is the U.S. in Asia in a stronger or weaker position now than it was when Donald Trump took office?
Well, good morning, everyone. Right. Good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here as part of the first time I've participated in an East-West Center International Media Conference, so delighted to be here. Look, Nisid, I don't like to think in terms of 18 months, in terms of big issues like trends and trajectories in Asia. Let me offer some continuities rather than, since everyone is focused on, you started off with focuses on changes and dynamics. I think the U.S. is in a far better position in Asia than one could imagine or what seems on the surface. Let me offer some reasons why I think that's the case. I think, first of all, our alliances have had ups and downs, but comparatively, I mean, one can think of 1991 in the case of Japan, 2003 in the case of Korea. These difficulties are nothing like they were then. There was a time when we had trade frictions with Japan which were fundamental and serious. Our relations with Australia are very good. Second reason is we have a lot more partners in the region than we had 10 years ago. We've normalized relations with Vietnam. We have relations with India, which were unimaginable 10, 15 years ago. We have relations with Singapore post-1991 in a strategic framework agreement. We have relations with Southeast Asia, et cetera. So post-75, we've had a real increase of relations. Third is some fundamental features. I mean, if you compare US relations with allies and partners with China's relations with Asia, or intra-Asia dynamics, the US balance of relations is quite a bit better on the whole than those two sets of relationships. So that's where I think we are. I think there are always challenges, there are ups and downs, there are ongoing issues related to trade and other matters, but the fundamental structural picture for the United States in the region is still pretty favorable.
But would you say it's on a trend line? Is it headed in a positive direction, in a negative direction?
One can't be complacent. Things change very quickly. The Cold War ended. We've had big shocks in the system, in the post-1945 system, whether it was going off the gold standard or the shock of normalization with China or 1991 Gulf War, et cetera, 9/11. But yeah, I think it's manageable, but it requires management.
All right. Okay, so on that note, let me turn to Raja. The U.S. is asking more of its partners in the region, including Japan, India, and Australia in particular, the so-called Quad countries. And at the same time, those countries are facing trade threats from the U.S. They're seeing the U.S. withdraw from the TPP. How reliable does the U.S. seem to countries like India, and how much do you really want to invest in this partnership, or do you feel safe investing in it?
I think none of the countries you mentioned have the option of turning their back on the United States. Yeah, I said none of the countries mentioned by you have a chance of, have an option of turning their backs to the United States. Because the US still remains the dominant player, both in this part of the world, militarily. It's also still the largest economy in the world. The challenge for us in Asia, I think, is to adapt to structural change that Trump is demanding. Normally, we assume that the hegemonic power or the dominant power demands a change in the status quo. But what we're seeing under Trump is really three important things. One, he's saying the rules of globalization that America had set up are not working for American people. So he wants a renegotiation of those principles. Second, he's saying, look, you can't have open borders anymore because the way it has played out domestically, we can't have open borders. Three, he's saying that why am I paying for allies who are rich and can do it for themselves? So I think these three have been fairly consistent parts of his worldview. So I think the challenge for us is not to, we are not American citizens, so we can't just denounce Trump. We have to deal with this new reality in Washington and find ways of adapting to it. Second, I think Trump is going to force, in some sense, on the security part of it, that if we don't pitch in more for our own regions, for our own security, and that Trump is saying, look, you got to do it. I mean, we had the luxury of expecting the Americans to do the heavy lifting, and then the luxury of criticizing for doing exactly that. But today, we have to, the best construction is burden sharing. Or other is to say we need to do more for our own security. So in some senses, Trump has given us a wake-up call that you can't just leave your fortunes for the way the Americans are going to deal with it. We got to contribute more. We got to do more. We got to pick up the slack.
Just from the perspective of Delhi, where you were as of a month ago, how is that playing? Is that burden welcomed? Is it accepted? Are they ready for it?
At least for India, I mean, I think on the burden sharing issue, I think India wants to do more. It wants to be a major power. So actually, there's a nice fit between Trump saying you guys have to do more, to India saying we want to do more in our region. How that works out, we got to see, but so we have no problem on that front. On his policies towards terrorism and on Afghanistan, he's taken a more tougher posture, which is welcome to India. He's talking about a new balance of power in Asia. That's also welcome for India. But we have two issues. One is the immigration issue. I don't think Indians can keep saying we have a right to work in the United States. That's what most Indian engineers think, but I think we got to deal with that in a slightly different form now. And second is on the trade issue, we got to negotiate. I mean, I think forget the rules-based order stuff. That when it doesn't work for the largest kid on the block, you got to renegotiate. And I think India has generally been a laggard on trade issues, so we got to do a lot more to be able to negotiate with Trump a deal that's seen as at least equal and beneficial for both countries.
All right, so let me just follow up with one more thing before I get on China specifically, though. India is in an awkward position. It's obviously a major economic partner, and yet a lot of what the U.S. is asking India to do is inevitably going to cause frictions there. For the Indians in relationship with the Chinese, yeah. Is India ready for that? Are they?
No, I don't think we're really worried about U.S. pushing us into doing things against China. I mean, I think we've seen Prime Minister Modi has sat down with President Xi Jinping. But there is an issue in terms of, when it comes to the boundary dispute, I don't have a boundary dispute with the Americans, I have it with the Chinese. My trade deficit is with the Chinese. I have a $40 billion trade surplus with the Americans. So I think there is a problem for India in terms of China's power at this point. But we don't want to become, say, America's cat's paw. We want to deal with this new reality. We're also quite aware that Xi Jinping and Trump are actually talking about a deal on trade issues. That actually, for all the confrontation, there's still intense negotiations between the two sides. So we got to be prepared for both a potential Cold War or a condominium. So I would say a strong India that must actually can help contribute to a more stable thing by following its own policy. And that we need a China that's more accommodating towards its neighbors. We need a US that better understands the regional security composition.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to Zakir Hussain, the foreign editor of the Straits Times, who I'm now going to put on the spot since he just arrived. But speaking of countries like India, that are these sort of middle countries out here in Asia that aren't competing on the same level as the U.S. and China. If you look at Southeast Asia in particular, Singapore and so on, you would say, I was living here up until about a year ago. So in 2016, there was a real sense that China had sort of overextended, had overshot within the region, had been a little too aggressive, a little too arrogant, and was losing ground. But then they recalibrated, right? They sent out new diplomats, they changed their rhetoric. They were helped by a change of administration in the Philippines and some other dynamics elsewhere. Do you think they have recovered within this region, recovered their position? Do you think what is the relationship that ASEAN has to China now?
I think ASEAN's relationship with China is one of sort of ambivalence. I think China is now the largest trading partner for almost every ASEAN member. It's a source of tourism. I think both sides have a target of 30 million Chinese tourists coming to ASEAN in the next few years. But at the same time, they've also been aware, the history of ASEAN countries and China has been mixed. Vietnam, Indonesia, there's sort of this historical baggage. And I think there's this awareness that perhaps 2015 and 2016, maybe, I agree with you that there was a sense that China could have overextended itself. And it helped that the US pivot to Asia was sort of underway already by then. But I think at the end of the day, none of the ASEAN countries wants to be put in a position of choosing between China and the US. And I think the next few years could see some space for ASEAN to be this platform where, China, the US, but also India, Japan, Australia, come together and settle the differences and try and create not an alternative, but a sort of slightly different regional order, where even though the US is pulling back from, somewhat pulling back from its involvement in the region, there's space for greater cooperation and partnership on other issues. And I think Raja's point on trade is key. India's been one of the holdouts. After the US pulled out of the TPP, there was a bit more momentum on getting the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And I think it'd be significant because it'd be one of the few formal partnerships that brings together China, India, Japan, Korea, as well as all the ASEAN countries together on one page. And, I think if the RCEP I think this weekend you're seeing talks in Tokyo. The hope is still to conclude negotiations by the end of this year. And I think if that, goes ahead, it'll send a strong signal, that trade wars really shouldn't have a place in the region.
That makes sense. Ms. Wu, as you can tell as we're having this discussion that China in this region obviously has is a huge shadow. Its investment is welcomed. Governments, though, are also suspicious of its ambitions and influence. And some of this has to do with politics, but some of it has to do with perception as well, right? And China has never been very good at telling its own story outside of China. From your perspective, do you think that's changing, or how do you think it should change? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Thank you for your question. Well, I just came here the day before. I noticed, the products made in China, the tourists who come from China, and China has become so.
Can people hear, by the way, up there? Yeah.
Okay, I will do. Can you hear me? But nevertheless, yesterday I was here for the whole day, and I asked so many of our journalists, how much do you know about China? About, where does all the information about China come from? To my surprise, all the questions is like, the answers like, we get our information from CNN, from BBC, Washington Post. I asked again, what about the Chinese media? None of them, almost none of them. They said, okay, we watch any of the TV programs from China or read newspapers about China Daily or Radio Beijing, the radio programs. So today I'd like to share some of my thoughts and findings about this, about the Chinese media. Because recently I have been doing a research on this particular field about CGTN, China Global TV Network, which was launched by the end of 2016. And we can see so many changes have been taken place. So without knowing what the China is doing, and then just by guessing or by long-held views towards China, I think it's not the whole picture. So if we can understand fully about Chinese media, what they are doing, especially the international ones, and then we can have a full picture about what China is, and that helps to understand between peoples and nations and avoid misunderstandings. Let me show you one of the characters. I bet some of you here can read this Chinese character. Wang is a famous one. Either could be the family name, or it means the king in Chinese. And king, here we can see 3 horizontal bars supported by 1 vertical pillar. That means the king. And if you want to become the king, and you have to unite the heaven and earth. So if this is like, the first horizontal bar is the content, and the second one is technology, and the third one is accessibility. And by the vertical pillar, it means the integration. So if we want to develop our media and let the world know about this, and this character is so vital. I like to put 1 stroke on the top, and the meaning of this word changed. Okay, it's about, could be the fundamental, and could be the God in Western world. This character means this. And then the fundamental of our media is the users. All this explained by the controller of CGTN, Mr. Jiang Heping. In English, maybe you heard of his name, is Peace. And one more thing is that this is what they are doing in reforming their media convergence, and at least provides an alternative media source for the world. So when it comes to the content, which the first horizontal bar, and then I can share you with some of the stories about Chinese media is doing, like about because yesterday I went to a panel, and the picture portrayed was like all the dark sides about China, but we can see the different pictures of China. The stories we are telling now, we can see about the 2 sessions, which our reporter has done, the negative side of thing. Yes, please.
The question is simple. Have you ever voted no?
不投，没有，
从来没有吗？
没有，
您有没有投过否决的票吗？
没有，
赞成票，赞成票。
当然赞同了，那非常好，赞同。
那以前投过一些否决票吗？
没有，因为我觉得我是第一届，就这一届嘛，我觉得这一届政府都非常负责任，啊，做的也非常好，肯定要投赞成票的啊。
您好，咱们这些报告，咱们投过否决票吗？啊？投过否决票吗？For China's nearly 3,000 deputies reviewing the government reports and making suggestions, major forms of supervision. Although dissenting voices in the NPC are still very few, many see them as normal practice and a key mechanism in the checks and balances. There's been rising consensus not to simply obey.
Okay, you may
follow.
stop. Thank
Lawyer
you.
Li Dajin, who's also
Yes,
an
thank
NPC
you.
deputy, says
This is
what's
just
behind the changing attitudes towards the...
Just a glimpse of what we, doing the reporting about, now the positive side of our government. Besides this, I can give you some of the other examples like, LGBT, which have been talked about, right? But in previous years, it's not allowed. We can see in the year 1997, right, and also 2001, people will be regarded as kind of mental disorder if you belong to any of the category. And also you can see the picture of the doctor. He mentioned about in the reporting that before that, he had operation annually only 10 or more than 10, but now things have changed dramatically. It's more than 1,000 operations each year. You can see the changes. And also, we talked about the buying vote when it comes to election locally, and also about the BRICS country. Last year, I was happened to be invited at the debating the BRICS country. We invited, the BRICS country of 5 countries together. That was lively shown through the internet. So when it comes to the censorship, is there any way that the live show can be censored? So that answers the question. Okay, about the tech, I'm going to wrap up within like 1 minute or so. The live show, and we moved from green room to on the scene. And also the mobile newsroom is another way of doing the reporting. When it comes to accessibility, TV news, apps, websites, digital media, and video footage also will be available. You can check the smartphone, either Facebook, Twitter, Reddish, and Instagram. You can read every information you want with the help of that. So our chairman, Xi Jinping, mentioned that internet way of thinking is vital and important. So we can see briefly about the changes of the Chinese media, just CGTN.
All right.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump into the next one.
And also, one more thing, the
last
last thing is that about, this can be recognized worldwide by the New York Festival, who win the Silver Award, and also the U.S. International Film Video Festival, the Golden Camera, and Emmy Award as well.
Okay.
So thank you so much for this.
All right. Satu, let me move over to you. So I think being here in Singapore, the one subject we can't avoid is North Korea, right? I don't know how many people were here for this summit, but what do you make of how the landscape in Northeast Asia has changed post summit? Obviously, it's very soon. There are lots of unknowns. But you see that Kim immediately went to Beijing afterwards. A lot of people are saying the only people who got what they wanted out of this were China and North Korea. What's your sense of it?
Well, my sense of the summit that occurred here between our president and President Kim, I don't know what to make of it. We'll have to see. Day before yesterday or 2 days ago, the president signed an extension of the sanctions and articulated the view publicly that North Korea continues to present a threat to the United States. He said in the run-up to the campaign, which resulted in his electoral victory, that he would do 3 things: impose sanctions, consider all options, and I forget the phrase he used, but perhaps it was, I'd be willing to meet President Kim. He's done all 3. And so we are at this juncture where the question is, what next? Many of you may have read that our Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, is going out to Beijing. I believe he's en route. He pointedly said in that this is one area of convergence. So and on the way back from that Beijing visit, he's obviously stopping in our allies in Japan and Korea, South Korea. So we'll just have to see. Does this mark a fundamental change or an opportunity? Possibly. I mean, my own sense is it's worth exploring. And the fact that Singapore hosted this meeting is a first step. It's not the end point, but my view is we ought to give it a go.
Raja, you said you look like you had something to add.
I think the summit that took place here, I think, has a huge potential to transform the structure of international relations in Northeast Asia. So I think the problem is if you focus it narrowly on denuclearization, that's where much of the American media have done, and I think their answers have all been, Trump has given away the store. But if you see it as actually a rearrangement of the structure, that Trump is doing three things. One is trying to build a relationship with a country they've had no access to. Two, he's encouraged South and North Korea to find ways of reconciliation. That's probably the great role that President Moon has played. So after 70 years, that you have actually a Korean nationalism trying to reunite, not unite is too strong a word, reconcile at least, is again, I think, a huge change. This, of course, is going to force both China, which thought itself as the #1 actor in Korea. Today, the Korean leader is talking directly to the Americans. Of course, he goes back and briefs or to the Chinese, but the main driver is coming from the South and from the United States. So I think the Chinese have to adjust to a Korean peninsula that's probably not as tied to China as it is today. And second, for Japan, I think it will have to come to terms with Korean nationalism. It has to come to terms with what is its role going to be. That it cannot merely depend on the Americans. Americans are saying take a larger role. And I think, again, if you go back to Trump's election campaign, he said, why does it matter if South Korea and Japan have nuclear weapons? So I think it's not that he's going to help them get nuclear weapons, but the fact is there needs to be a local balance of power. And that America is not going to sit in the middle and try and do everything. So I think in America, that plays with softer hands is going to compel everyone in the region to adapt to a new dynamic.
Is this healthy? Do you think Japan and South Korea should have a nuclear
I think it's
deterrent?
about time. If you think the American taxpayer is going to keep doing for the next 70 years what he has done for the last 70 years, I think we are living, that's part of the problem, much of the debate in Washington. And here is, we expect the Americans, they've done this for 70 years, they're going to keep doing this. So if you accept, look, some change is inevitable. How do we manage that change? I think it's about time. Asia is rich. It has the capabilities today. And you can't keep saying Americans must do everything and we have the right to criticize them.
Okay. There's one other area where I think money would be welcome, and that's in terms of investment in infrastructure, particularly in Southeast Asia, but in South Asia as well. So China is obviously trying to expand its influence through Belt and Road investments, as well as provide real infrastructure and export some overcapacity and so on. There's multiple reasons for it. But there's natural suspicion you see in Malaysia in particular, this kind of backlash against these projects. Is China adapting quickly enough to these concerns in Southeast Asia to sort of reduce fears and actually make it more, or are these investments always going to be somewhat fragile and dependent on which government happens to be in power, and as soon as it changes, then all of a sudden everything gets thrown into question again?
I think we saw some of that in Malaysia, where the change of government saw some of these projects being built. And I think it's true to a sense that the nature, the way in which some of that investment was being built, there were reports of sort of, companies bringing in workers from China to, do the projects. And in a sense, it wasn't just happening in Malaysia, but I think in parts of South Asia as well. So the sense that, yes, Belt and Road is good for the local economy, but it needs to involve and engage local communities. It can't just be a wholesale redevelopment without consultation and without, due negotiation. And I think a fair balance that can succeed successive, that can weather change of governments. I think you're seeing some of that being rewritten in Malaysia, and I think it's probably for the better because some of these investments will, I think, in the long term be more stable. And the fact of the matter is Southeast Asian countries do need these investments. Not just Malaysia or Sri Lanka or Pakistan, but places like Myanmar and Laos. China's state-owned companies are really the only ones with the scale and experience. And I think my view is, I think the Chinese diplomats have been quite adept at nuancing their message. It's just that I think it'll take some time for that to happen.
Okay. On that note, Raja, I think it's you often see in the American media in Washington this automatic assumption that greater Chinese influence through the Belt and Road is dangerous, that it's somehow bad for the U.S. But aren't there areas where greater Chinese influence could actually be helpful? I'm thinking in terms of combating militancy in Pakistan, helping out with the peace negotiation in Afghanistan. These are areas where China has much more influence now than it ever did because of its infrastructure investments. Is there a role for them to play in other?
Look, I think if you think of what China is doing with Belt and Road, I think if you can, one way of thinking about it is, look, there is the rise of Chinese capitalism, and Chinese capitalism is expanding to open up new markets. It's opening up connectivity. Much of what the British Raj did in this part of the world, 200 years ago, Singapore was barely there. There was no Bombay, there was no Madras, there was no Calcutta, there was no Hong Kong. But these were created by rising British capital that created connectivity's new standards. But I think, so in that sense, there is a general tendency towards modernization, expansion, creation of markets. But the problem, I think, where the Chinese initiative, I think is going to get deeper, I would think, is the terms of that engagement. Interest rates, the question of whether debt trap, today New York Times has a major story on Sri Lanka. So India, for example, has criticized is one of the few countries that has criticized the Chinese Belt and Road. I think there was one question of sovereignty, but that's a territorial dispute. But on the general question, should it meet the global norms? I think that point will not disappear. I think how much the Chinese nuance. I think that issue, because more people are raising this question. You had in Malaysia, you had a question. You had in Southeast Asia, the question is being raised elsewhere. So I think that point, what are the terms of engagement? My view is it's not enough to criticize the Chinese. That if we give an alternative, like the Japanese have done very well, their partnership for quality infrastructure, $140 billion has been put on the table. They have a long experience in doing, both economic and infrastructure modernization. If we say, look, if I go to Sri Lanka and merely criticize the Chinese, that's one thing. But if I go and say, look, here is an alternative, we can do this project better for you. I think that's where, if the major powers, India, Japan, US, come up with an alternative, then I think that will compel the Chinese to alter their terms. So at this point, there's no really a competition. So I think the key for us is we'll work with the Chinese where it is possible. We must offer an alternative where it is possible. And we must actually do more collective multilateral effort at modernizing the infrastructure in this part of the world.
Yes, Satu?
I want to just comment. I generally very much agree with Raja. A couple of things I want to say. A bias, because I was in the engineering and infrastructure business for so many years. There's nothing wrong with infrastructure in and of itself. I wouldn't make the comparison with British colonialism in China, because now China is entering places with modern post-colonial nationalisms. And so you have protests in Vietnam, you have pushback in Sri Lanka, you have pushback in the Pacific Islands. This is resulting from countries that are no longer colonial states. They're post-colonial, they have identities, they have nationalisms, and they don't want to be pushed around, they don't want to be in debt. So you see this pattern. In and of itself, infrastructure is neutral. It's generally a good thing to produce. Second, China's relative contributions to infrastructure far underweight. The rhetoric around them is far greater than the actual implementation. If you look at implementation rates of Japanese infrastructure projects across the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, they're far higher. And the third is, by discussing this in the US-China framework, forgive me for saying this a little crudely, but we leave the countries who want infrastructure off the hook. If they don't want to be in debt to China, if they don't want lax environmental standards, if they don't want political corruption to come hand in hand, then they ought to create the rules and norms and structures that make private sector as well as government-backed infrastructure attractive. And that's incumbent upon those countries, not upon us supplying it. It's not a demand-supply relationship. This is a market. There's nothing about roads, bridges, et cetera, that require any kind of great technology. We've done this since the Roman ages, right? So we can do it, but countries in the region need to create the economic incentives to attract European companies, American, Canadian, Chinese, Japanese, et cetera. So.
Very good point. Ms. Wu, you had something?
Yes, talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, I think that that's something that several countries along that road benefit a lot. It's not only the Chinese take advantage of that. Last week, our university co-hosted a Belt and Road Initiative conference. All the journalists come from more than 55 countries, and they participated. They speak highly of what China is doing about this Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the journalists who's from Nigeria, who was sitting beside me during the conference, he said that, we need a lot of support from your country in terms of technology, AR system like Tencent, the man who showed us yesterday, right, to develop so fast. So how could we, develop together and work together? That's something important. So many countries, they say they need our help. Another example is that one of my PhD students is from Pakistan. He's studying here with the support of the Chinese government, and everything is for free. And he loved the country so much, he said that he wouldn't leave after finishing his job. And one of the students of the master program for the international ones, he stayed after the graduation and then worked for China Radio International for 2 years now. So it's not only China who benefits that.
There is demand, yeah. I was just about to switch to the audience. We've got about 15 minutes left, so we can take questions from the audience. So please just raise your hand. There's some microphones here. Anybody? Don't be shy. Okay, there's somebody over there. Yes.
Thank you.
Can you identify yourself, please?
My name is Sanjar Sohail. I'm from Afghanistan. Can you elaborate a little bit about the magics and of the relationship between China and Pakistan? Because despite many hard evidence that was provided by Afghanistan that Pakistanis are sending terrorists to Afghanistan, Chinese government are still supporting the Pakistani government. We captured the insurgent from Igor, the region in Xinjiang, and sent a list, and even the officials from the Chinese government came to Afghanistan, investigated the issue. It was 25 terrorists from China. But despite those hard evidence, they are still supporting, and they do not support the reasons and the evidence that we provided to Chinese government. Thank you.
Roger, do you want to talk? Yeah. Why don't we take 2 or 3 and then we'll go through. Okay. So, sir.
Yes, I'm Howie Severino from the Philippines. I work for a TV station, GMA Network. One of the panelists mentioned the Philippines in the context of recent political change in the Philippines being beneficial to Chinese interests.
I take blame for that, but go ahead. Don't blame the panelists. I think that was me.
Yes. I'm just interested in any kind of elaboration on that point, because there is a school of thought that a lot of it is just rhetoric coming from our president, when on the ground not much pivoting has actually taken place, because there's still a military alliance with the United States, and when there was a serious conflict or crisis down south in the Philippines, China was nowhere to be found assisting Philippine forces. It was actually still American forces, and to a more limited extent Australian forces, which are traditional Philippine allies. So I'm wondering about your perspectives about whether things are really changing strategically in Southeast Asia when it comes to Southeast Asian-China relations, or in particular Philippine-China relations and Philippine-U.S. relations.
Okay, great. Should we take one more and then we can turn to the panelists? Yes, ma'am.
Morning, I'm Bhagya from the Straits Times. My question was for Dr. Satu Limaye. How do you see Mr. Trump's trade war playing out with China as well as with Europe? The news this morning was about Harley-Davidson moving its production facilities out of the US. Is the American consumer going to feel the pain at some point? Are they prepared to feel the pain? And is that going to show at the midterm polls? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll take this round. Roger, do you want to address China-Pakistan relations? Or would you rather, I don't want to make you put you in the position of answering for the Chinese government, but.
Yeah, it's kind of, because I'm not the scholar, so
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure about representing the government. But anyway, I think on the whole, the relationship between the two countries is good. And also, I still like to take one of the examples from my university. 4 of the journalists a month ago who came to our university to do research, for half-a-year research about China. Based on the Belt and Road initiatives. They enjoyed their life in our university so much. Not only the courses they took, but also, the Chinese traditional opera, kunqu. They wear the costumes and then they learn how to sing and dance. Afterwards, they wrote an article about this in their own language and have it published in their newspaper. Yeah, this is, one of the examples to see people, they're so friendly to each other.
Right. Rob, do you want to address that quickly?
I think on the Chinese concerns on terrorism are fairly deep, but their partnership with Pakistan has been there for decades. What is higher than the Himalayas, deeper than the Indian Ocean, whatever. So there is a tension in Chinese policy, which is one of keeping Pakistan on its side, but at the same time, it is concerned about what's happening in Xinjiang. It's also trying to develop a relationship with Afghanistan. It's beginning to give aid and assistance to the present Afghan government. It's also trying to mediate between Pakistan and Afghanistan, a kind of role that traditionally the US had played in the past. So I think there is a change in China's approach to Afghanistan, Pakistan, but it is still not significant enough to alter the dynamics of deep-rooted China-Pakistan strategic relationship. Whether in the coming days as things go bad in Afghanistan, I think we are at a difficult moment. How that policy would evolve remains to be seen. But my sense is the Chinese do put pressure on Pakistan privately when their own interests are involved. We've seen that happen in 2004 under Musharraf, where it was forced to deal with the Red Mosque incidents. So I think a lot would depend on how the dynamic would unfold in Pakistan-Afghanistan border in the coming months and years.
Zakir, maybe you can take the Philippines question. It's a good point. We from the outside often say, well, we've lost the Philippines to China, we've lost Malaysia to China, but on the ground, not that much changes. What do you think?
I don't think much has changed. I think some of it is, I have to admit, I think the media is sort of overemphasizing some of these shifts, and I think these shifts are happening, but they don't change the fundamental. I think at the very core, all the diplomatic establishments in all the ASEAN capitals don't want to significantly pivot to either power. It's true that many of them have long-standing relationships with the US, and perhaps they're recalibrating some of it. But at the end of the day, they don't want to be in a position to choose, whether I've got to side with Washington or with Beijing. Which is why I think things like a trade war and greater tensions are unsettling to practically all ASEAN countries. Not sure if that answered the question.
Well, speaking of trade wars, Satu, do you want to address that?
Well, yeah, there's a whole panel after this later in the morning on trade wars. Let me pick up where Zakir left off on Southeast Asia. I started off by saying overall, this had asked me to comment. I think there's far more continuity than discontinuity in U.S. relations with Asia, notwithstanding all the rhetoric and all of the coverage, et cetera. I think there are changes brewing. We've seen these changes come and go over the decades. As I sort of pointed out, 2 periods to really look at comparatively are even the Quad. I can cite to you J.D.B. Miller from Australia's 1968 book, India, Australia, and Japan in a New Asia. If that wasn't the Quad, I don't know what is. After 1975 U.S. retreat. So things come and go. Cycles change. I'm not suggesting, as I said, things need to be managed. You can't be complacent. There's a lot of work to do. But there's a lot more continuity. The president met with all four Southeast Asian leaders in Washington within the first year of office, with Vietnam, with Thailand, with Singapore, and I believe, who did I miss? Malaysia. He visited on his trip out in November several leaders while he was out here for the summits. ASEAN centrality remains the core U.S. policy objective. We're still members of regional organizations. So that brings me to the trade war. First of all, I don't know how the trade war is going. I appreciate our colleague from the Straits Times pointing out the Harley Davidson. I looked at it with great interest because I've always sort of aspired to own a Harley Davidson. So I was wondering what the tariff implications are for me. But if I can get approval in the Home Office. But the more important thing is look at the Canadian poll on NAFTA issues, which suggests a majority of Canadian companies are also looking for moving their facilities to the U.S. I don't know how all of this will play off. There's a panel of experts coming up. I defer to them. I don't know where we are. I think it hinges on a kind of fundamental assessment. How important is the U.S. market as your end destination for a production supply chain? And where does your value come from? And the U.S. market at $20 trillion a year is the largest, most productive, growing market in the world. It's, if you measure in terms of financial flows, if you measure in the 2017 UN report on immigration, if you measure on where family visas for legal immigration go and others, it's still a very attractive destination. How will this play out? You asked me in the midterms. Don't know, but if you look at Axios polling this morning, trade does not appear as the primary security concern. Russia is now at 20%, China at 19% on rankings by Americans. If you look at Midwestern states where the president's polling runs with senators up for off-cycle elections in November 2018, the president compares favorably in those states. If soybeans get worse, if agricultural products get worse, if a range of other products get worse in these targeted tariffs that other countries are imposing on us, then we'll see. But as of now, the 90% approval rating of the president in the Republican Party does not suggest to me definitively that between now and November he will face a major implication. But we'll see. We'll see how these tariffs play out. We'll see if, as Raja suggested, a deal is to be had between the United States and China. I mean, on IPR and other issues, on tech, there's no question on this. So let's see.
I think we have time for just one more question if anybody wants to jump. Sir. All right.
Thank you. Really interesting panel. Guy Taylor again from Washington Times newspaper. Could you go back to the issue of the Quad and just give us an update on the extent to which it's dead? A lot of the sources of mine in Washington, I bring it up and they say, well, that's not happening. And I know there's a lot of nuance there, but I just, what's your take from the folks that you're talking to about it? Thank you.
Guy, I can't tell, are you looking at me or Raja? Okay, Raja, okay. Okay, well, look, you know, it's a great thing when democracies who are allies and partners as close as Japan and the United States and Australia, Japan and Australia, and our partner, an increasing strategic partner, India, cooperate with each other. That to me is a good net benefit to the international system, to security, to stability. I think the notion that has been made that the Quad will in some way run the Indo-Pacific security architecture is a very far-off thing. That's not the aim. I think it was yesterday or day before yesterday, we had the Malabar exercises between the US, Japan, and India off the coast of Guam as we move to RIMPAC, I think, in 3-4 days. So, you know, my sense is it's great that we're working with each other, we're exchanging information, we're learning how we operate. The India-Japan relationship has been growing over time. Obviously, the US, Japan, Australia one has been quite substantive. But the notion that the Quad will replace American ability to operate and keep its alliance and partnership commitments in the region, which remain, as far as I can tell on the military side of the house, unchanged. I mean, the things we're doing, the kind of deployments we're making, the exercise patterns we're conducting, the kinds of assets that we're devoting to the region remain fundamentally sound. They remain consistent. They haven't changed. They haven't been withdrawn. There have been adjustments on certain exercise patterns and things, but overall, the core of American presence and forward posture is still there, and the Quad simply adds to it. It doesn't substitute for it.
You want to take one last one?
Just briefly, I mean, I think the Quad has been over-determined, I would think, that many of us have made it the center point of what's going to happen in the region. But if you see the so-called triad between US, India, Japan has moved on quite fast. There is US-Japan alliance, then there's 2+2 between US, Japan, Australia. So you have many overlapping areas where things are actually moving. My sense is that if you look at the general expansion of intra-regional defense cooperation and between the region and the United States, that is certainly expanding. So I think when exactly Quad would actually materialize, I would think we all thought it was dead a few months ago, then there was another meeting. So I would say it depends on what the Chinese do, to be frank. If the Chinese are seen as putting more pressure, the regional powers, those who are on the China's periphery, will be compelled to draw closer to the Americans and between themselves. But if Chinese, once again, I think we're seeing a bit of a charm offensive. That could, if Chinese are nice to neighbors, maybe there was no need for Quad in the first place.
Yeah, sure.
If I can just add one brief point. I think many in Southeast Asia are quite wary of the Quad because the thinking is, it leaves what about us in the middle. So I think there's another platform that it's a lot softer, it's a lot less effective, I think, still. But the ASEAN defense ministers have sort of expanded and brought China and the US into military exercises in recent years. And I think although the focus now is on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, military medicine, I think there's some serious intent to actually expand these and sort of broaden. So you have another platform where China and the US and other militaries do work together increasingly as well.
Okay, on that positive note, I think we are out of time, but join me in thanking the panelists for this wonderful discussion. Thank you.